Welcome back to a new episode about custom positioning. We are finally at the stage where you understand the most important parts of the container, but now we're going to talk about the things that don't look like they are part of the container. This can mean many things. Sometimes things overlap, and then it's not always immediately clear to what container each element belongs. For example, like this item, does that belong to this top one? What about this one? Does it belong to this container or part of this image? Or for example, this little card over here, is that part of the image? So how do you do that inside of the container because they overlap? And of course, our own project with these things floating around, which also animate when you start scrolling, so they have to be separate images. So how do you do stuff like that? I want to talk about a few things here because there are multiple ways to do custom positioning and not all of them have the same effect. The most easy and obvious one I would say is to use background images. For example, here you can see this circle with the gap in it, and here you can see a circle as well. And let me show you, I have actually made it really easy for myself. I didn't do anything hard. I just made a background overlay with an image. As you can see, that just with an SVG that just has these two items in it. Really simple. So that is this image. I just exported it as an SVG, and then I put that SVG as the background overlay on the background container. So that's the first important rule. If you can fix it with the background overlay feature, then please do it, make your life easy, because custom positioning is a bit harder. Now the second thing is margin and padding. We have already discussed margin and padding in some other episodes, but right now we're going to use it to custom position things. And as you know by now, padding is the space on the inside. So when you delete the space on the inside like this, then there's no space on the inside. And margin is the space on the outside. And when you use that on background containers, then it creates a gap which you cannot use anymore. So that's why I don't recommend that, as I said before. But margin is very powerful to push things away or to drag things into each other. But before we're going to do the custom positioning, I first want to show the difference between padding and margin in a container. So for example, we have a situation like this with a background container, two text layers, and then three vertical containers. As you can see right here, vertical containers with some widgets in it. If you would increase the padding, so the inside, then you will get an effect like this, 25 pixels. If you would do that on the outside, then you clearly see that it pushes the other items away, therefore making this one wrap because there's not enough space in the way I set up this background container. So that's where you can clearly see the difference. But not always. For example, you have this text layer and this one over here. If I now increase the space on the right, so let's first try to add 50 pixels of margin on the right, then you see that it doesn't push this item away, which is what you would expect because we just saw in another example that it pushes the other item away. Here, for example, let me try it again. Here's a background container, there's one next to it. So if I would then add 50 pixels, then it would push this one away. But then this also becomes smaller. So sometimes margin and padding seem like they're living their own life and not doing what you want, but that is because there are already settings applied to the container it is in. And since this container is set to horizontal, the container will try to squeeze these two items in it and therefore making this one smaller. So this item now pushes the other 30 pixels away, but then the settings of the mother container here says like, yeah, it's cool that you can do that, but we have already set up rules for this container. So that's why this one is going to be smaller as well. And this is the same in this container over here. And sometimes it's even weirder. So for example, in here, what is happening? Because if I add the margin in here, this item does not get pushed away, which is what you would expect because margin is space on the outside. And we're now saying push this 150 to the right. Doesn't happen. It happens on the inside. So what is actually happening? You can see it if you add a background color. So let's just do that real quick. I'm going to add a background color like this. And now you can start to see what is happening. So let's go back and delete that margin. All right. So if we add 50 pixels over here, you can see that it does actually push away, but it does it on the inside. This looks like padding, but padding is different because it creates space on the inside, therefore ignoring the background that I've set up. So if I would put 150 in here, you can see the background stays. So margin does push things away, but sometimes, depending on how you set up the container, it sacrifices itself so it still happens on the inside. I don't know why this is, because I think in CSS this is not really how it works. Or it could be that Elementor makes a mistake by interpreting it, because technically this widget should now be shorter. Maybe I just don't understand CSS code enough, I don't know. But you need to understand that margin by default pushes things away or attracts things. But sometimes, depending on how the container is set up, it doesn't push the items away. Let's go to another example. Because if you would just have a situation like this with 4 widgets on top of each other, and you would grab this text layer, go to advanced, unlink this, and then, for example, add 50 pixels to the bottom, it looks like it's adding padding, because if you would add padding to the bottom, it looks exactly the same. But here again, if you would add a background color, then you would see the difference. Padding does actually add spacing on the inside, while margin does not. Sometimes that difference is useful. For example, when you are working with background colors like this in a card. Let's now talk about the opposite of pushing things away, which is pulling things to you. Okay, so we have this example, and there are multiple ways to do this, but what I've done is I've just said like, hey, this is a separate container, this one over here, and then this one is also a separate container. And then we're going to use negative margin to pull this whole section up so that it gets to the point that I want. So let me show you how. You can see it over here. I have a background container with an image, a container with an image and a text, another text over here, and some social media icons. And I can now click on this widget, go to advanced, and I'm now going to go to margin. And instead of adding space on the top like this, we're going to add negative space. I'm now using rem, by the way, so let me go to pixels because rem is for another chapter. We're going to do, for example, -8 is pixels. That's not enough. -20, -60, and there you go. So now all of the items are pulled to the top because I changed the margin on this item. This doesn't happen with the other 2 custom positioning features I want to show you. So for now, remember that margin pushes or pulls all of the items that are below it as well. So it basically drags everything with it, because these widgets also change from position. You can also use it in the opposite way, because sometimes icons add unnecessary space on the bottom. So let me just drag in an icon like that. And let's say that we want to have this icon over here. You can see that it still adds a little bit of space over here, which is kind of annoying. And they still don't have settings to change that. So if you don't like that, then you can go unlink this. And then at the bottom, instead of adding, you can delete a few pixels. So go into the negative. And here you can see, now it fits perfectly. I've heard that Elementor is working on a feature right now, which I think is going to be part of the style tab, where you can say like, hey, make sure that it just fits the icon content. But for now, that's not here. So then you have to add some negative margin at the bottom to make sure it fits perfectly to the icon. Let's now go to the next feature, which is transform. So let's say that you want to add this image to this design, right? So where would you paste that? Well, you can do a few different things, but this is middle aligned. So let's just say that I'm going to add this image over here and then try to get it up here, right? So I'm just going to go to images and make sure it's part of this container and then select it from here. There's the image. Boom. Make it a bit smaller. Okay, just like that. For now, I'm going to put it at pixels because I don't want it to scale in any way. So I'm just going to put it like that, right? Now you have a few different options. You could, if you want to, mess around with margin in order to try to get it up. So for example, you unlink it and then you push it like that, as you can see, and it starts to move up. It works a little bit, right? Add something to the left. As you can see, it starts to scale. And also, these two are not middle aligned anymore because this one is part of that container. And you could then put it in a separate container, but then you create an extra container. So let's just not work with margin over here. And let's go to advanced and then to transform. Here's a feature that I don't think a lot of people use, but it's pretty nice. It's called offset. If you click on it, you just have 2 sliders. Look at this. You can just position it however you like with sliders. Beautiful, super easy to work with. But as you can see, there's another disadvantage over here, and that is that the widget space still stays. Sometimes that is what you want, but in this case, I don't want these two to be influenced by this image. So here it doesn't work. And where it also doesn't work, let me go back a step, is for this image itself. So let's say that you're like, wow, that's an easy feature, that looks great. We're not just gonna use margin over here. You know what? We are just gonna go to transform, offset, and then also, oh, oops, do it like that. But here you can see the difference. With margin, negative margin, these items were dragged up. But with the transform offset, the image, so the widget space, stays in the same position, but only the inside moves. So for this situation where I want to drag all of this content up, it's not smart to use offset. That's why I did use negative margin over here. Let's put it back, minus 160. Boom, because it drags all the content up. So now there's a last feature which I want you to show for custom positioning, and that can be found in the advanced tab over here with positioning called absolute. What this does is that it deletes all of the space it was taking up inside of the container. It doesn't really exist in terms of layout anymore, and that's why you are free to now move it around to wherever you want. This is almost like using a design tool. There are disadvantages to this as well. First, when you drag it, it doesn't always change the X and the I over here, which is what you want to use, because now if I preview it, now it appears back to that place. So I wouldn't use that. So let's go back a step and let's put it on absolute again. Now it switches to the left because by default you have to start somewhere in the container and you can only start in the corners for some reason. This is not because Elementor made this so hard. This is because the web is based on CSS. Elementor is based on CSS, and this is just a CSS property. So don't worry about it, but just know that this feature is a bit weird in how it behaves. Elementor also gives you a warning that you shouldn't use this because it seems so easy, right, to position everything like this. But it's not best practice because it does create problems in some situations. So I would also suggest to not use it if you can use the transform or margin and padding in order to achieve the same thing. But for this situation, I think it's great because it doesn't take up any space in this container anymore, making these two items align in the middle, which is what I want in my design as well. And then I can just use these sliders over here to position it in the way I want. And even if I close this panel, it stays perfectly in the position where I want it. So I hope that that made sense. This trick I've also used for the scooter. So here you can see a situation. Here's the final one. Here is the simpler one. So there's just this container with an image in it, nothing more, just an image. And here we have a container with some widgets in it with wrap, as you can see. So now if we want to add these images on top of it, we just go over here, we just add an image. Let's put it at the bottom and let's select it. Here you can find the first image is just a PNG. I'm going to import it and now I want to drag it on top of it. So I could, again, use negative margin if I want to, but then let's say minus 200, but then it keeps that widget space over here, which is kind of annoying because then it still messes with the padding I've set up in this container. It just takes up space and I don't want it to take up space. And the same is for the transform. Let me show that again, offset. As you can see, it still keeps this space, which then makes it impossible because this is now way too big. So here again, we're gonna go to absolute, position, absolute, and now it deletes the space. It acts like it doesn't exist anymore, basically. So now you can just, make your image a bit smaller, for example, and also make sure that it's in the right position to where you want it, like that. Great, right? Let's check it. It stays in position where I want. You can do that the same for this other image. And then you have an image that's basically floating somewhere. But the other image, so let's make a duplicate of this one, is beneath the scooter. So how do we do that? Let's first change the image. All right, let's also change its position. Now you can already see a problem because it starts scaling down. I will also show you how to solve that. But now I'm going to change its position like this. And now if you want this layer to be beneath the scooter and this one, then you need to play with the Z index. This is kind of like a layers panel, not this layers panel, but visually. So what I can do is that I can say like, okay, what is my design? My design says that this one should be at the top, then the scooter, and then this one. So 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's do that. We're gonna go to this image over here, Z index 3, step is gonna be 2, and the last image is gonna be 1. But now you can see that this one is beneath the step. So that's another trick to visually manipulate what is in front and what is not. Now the last thing which I want to show you is how you can make sure that it doesn't scale down, because as you can see it still tries to like stick to the size of this container. And now you can use a combination of absolute and then go up and then use negative margin on the right in order to get it like kind of like outside of the current container. As you can see, if I pull it, if I keep pulling it, it will go outside of the main container. So sometimes you need to use a combination between negative margin and absolute positioning in order to get the design that you want. This is pretty hardcore, as you can see. And many things can go wrong. So you really should pay a lot of attention to what you're doing here. Or you could do it even differently. Instead of using margin, you could go back and then go to transform and then use offset from here. That's also an option, but now it's too small. So then you could use scale as well in order to scale it and make it bigger. Here you can see there are multiple ways to make sure that you have the design that you want and to get it outside of the main container. And what's great about the transform feature is that you also have a hover state, so you can animate it. So you could be like, hey, when in normal setting, it's 200 offset, but when you hover over it, it's gonna go to 190. Let's see what happens. You see, when I hover over it, it changes. And you can also do that with skill, for example. So right now the skill is 1.4. So if you go to hover, you could be like, hey, 1.5. You see? Then it starts moving like this, which is also pretty cool. You could even do rotate, which I, by the way, have done for the course website. So if you go to the website and then course, on this page, I've also used all kinds of tricks. So here you can see it has rotate and skill. And then there's one more thing you need to know, and that is that transform, using the transform, sometimes also changes how margin and padding behaves. So here you can see a situation where there's no actual settings. So then it behaves how you would expect, right? When you add padding to the left, for example, 20 pixels, it adds some padding over here. But on this image, you can see if I add some padding to the left, then it adds padding to the right. Oh, this is on rem, so let's do a little lower number. You can see it adds it on the right, even though this one is on the left. And that is because this image in transform, I've used the flip. So sometimes you can just flip it, which is great because then you don't have to go into your editing tool, your Photoshop or XD or Figma. But then also remember that the left and right over here also flip. So I think that this answers everything about custom positioning. But let's say that you have a design where you really don't know how it's done. Put it on the Discord and or send me a DM on Discord and be like, hey, Reno, this layout is kind of challenging. Maybe we can build it together in the course. But I don't know any more features that will allow you to custom position things in Elementor. So I think I've covered all you need to know. So there are many ways, but all of them have their advantages. So use them wisely and don't be lazy with it. See what kind of effect they have on your layout, and then you can create almost anything you want. Thank you, and let's go to the next episode. Welcome back to another episode about a feature called Element Gap. So we've been talking about direction, justified content, and align items, and now we're going to talk about gap between elements. Because I already told you that I don't use these features a lot. And when I said that, I mentioned that I had a better way to create gaps between elements, and that is with the gap feature. So it's not really a hard thing to understand. It just makes your life easier than what it was before. So what it is right now is just a slider that allows you to increase or decrease the gap between all of the elements inside of a container. The default is 20. This is a global setting that you can change in the site settings. So if you go, if you go to the site settings and then go to layout over here, you can change it. I think that 20 pixels is great, but sometimes in your design, you want to have a more luxurious feel. You want a little bit more space between everywhere. And that's when you can change this value. So if you change it here, it will change throughout the whole website, but only on the places where you haven't set up the element gap. Right? So if you put it on 25 here, then everything, the default value will be 25 unless you set up something else per container. For now, I don't want to change it because I think 20 pixels is great, but you can even change it to a RAM value if you want to. Personally, I don't do that. I just leave it at 20 pixels. But sometimes when my design is a little bit different, then I use 24 or 26. But this really depends on the grid you're using. So most people will not change this value. As you can see, the gap does not only influence horizontal, but also vertical. So keep that in mind as well. Some people have asked if they can use percentages over here because they want to make their website fully responsive. But this will create problems. I've tried it with so many different ways. I've spent hours on trying to make the percentage work. But finally, I realized that it's really hard for the computer to make this work because 2% on a horizontal scale can work because it can calculate what 2% is from here to here because this is based on pixels. But 2% on the height can never be calculated by the computer because how high is a container going to be? It can go on until infinity. So that's why working with percentages for the element gap is just not smart. Please just trust me in this because I've spent hours to try to make this work. That's why I always leave it at pixels right now. And in order to explain the justify content in a previous episode, I had to create some space inside of the container in order to show how these controls work. But honestly, like I said, I don't use them that often because I always try to align my design to the grid. So for a design like this, I already know that I want all of my content to be aligned to the left and the right side to the grid. So then why would I even use space around and space evenly? That's why I only use space between to align some objects, but not to align items to the main grid. Aligning items to the main grid and making sure it touches the edges is not really easy, and that will be explained in an upcoming episode about wrapping. But by default, the items will grow and shrink anyways, so they will always be aligned to the sides anyways. So then the only thing you can do is just change the gap if you want to, and therefore I almost never have to use the justify content. I hope that this makes sense, how these two are connected. If my explanation was not so good here, then forget about it, it's not so important. Just leave the gap on 20 pixels. And then in a later episode, I will tell you how you can always make sure your design is aligned to the grid. Okay, let's move on to the next episode.